It's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you heartily to our today's event. This event is not only organized by our institute, but together with an institute you probably have not been confronted with, at least not in Vienna. We do it together with the Independence Public Library Foundation, with 4 letters. It means in German language IPLI or IPLI. And it's my great pleasure, therefore, to welcome you in the name of our institute, but also the other institute, and the president of the other institute, former Foreign Minister of Portugal and Ambassador António da Cruz, will do it personally in a few minutes. Before I hand over to our director, Zinkanell, I just want to say a few words to this double agenda we do have today. It means balancing act, EU strategy towards China and East Asian stability. We have to be aware that, of course, this tremendous rise of China, economically, but also politically, of course, has been changing the world and the world order fundamentally. And all of us, we are confronted with these developments, and therefore we have to try to also to define our own role in this context in a new way. At the other hand, the world has seen 2 hotspots. The one is the Middle East, especially Israel-Palestine, already for decades. And at the other hand, this has been also the East Asian region with the center of Taiwan and the Taiwan question. Not the Taiwan question alone, but of course also in the context with South China Sea and also neighboring North Korea. This certainly has become the center of strategic interests for the coming period. And therefore, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here. I do not want to speak longer, but I will want to hand over to Michael Zinkanell, and I wish you an interesting evening. Is maybe a little bit too much because we are almost in the middle of the day, and it's a summer day in addition to that, and insofar I hope you will enjoy it and not only be treated or confronted by the heat. Please, Michael.
Thank you very much, Werner Fasslabend, former Minister of Defense of Austria and President of the AIS. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear excellencies, distinguished experts, it's my great pleasure also to welcome you in my position as the director of the AIS, the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, and today's moderator of our event that, as mentioned before, we are having the great pleasure to organizing in collaboration with IPLI Foundation in Brussels, which we gave the name Balancing Act, EU Strategies Towards China and East Asian Stability. And we will divide today's evening symposium in 2 parts, in 2 panel discussions. I will introduce the distinguished speakers for both panel discussions afterwards, but I'll give you at least the names of the 2 panel discussions so you'll get an overview of what to expect for tonight. The first panel is called the Strategic Mosaic, Trends and Transformations in EU-China Policies. And then in the second panel discussion, we will focus on Facilitator or Spectator, an open question, assessing EU's role in East Asian stability and security. And before, again, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. We have also a very distinguished keynote speech. But before that, I would also like to hand over to Ambassador and Minister António da Cruz, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Portugal and Chairman of IPLI for your welcoming remarks, sir. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Director. It's a pleasure to be at the Vienna School of International Studies and to have the first collaboration, the first partnership between our IPLI Foundation and the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. Do you want me to start speaking or just the introductory notes? Can do it? Just an introduction words would be more important. Yeah, okay. So it will be a pleasure to be here and to talk about the European Union and China relations. This is the first, we had a partnership between IPLI Foundation and the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, and this is our first organization. With me it's Tim Reno, who is our Director General, and Alicja, she is based here in Vienna, and she collaborates with us. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope it's just the beginning of our partnership, and I would like to thank the Austrian Institute to choose the European-China relations, because this is, I believe, for all of us, European members, a very important subject, but also for all the world, because China represents an Asian power, a global power, and it is very important to think about our relations with China. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador de Cruz, Chairman of IPLI. When we organized this session, we were also thinking who could set the scene for today's and tonight's event, and we thought of no one better suitable to combine both the Austrian and the European perspective towards China with his long-standing expertise as a diplomat. Therefore, I'm very pleased to welcome to you the former Austrian ambassador to China and then to Japan, as well as the former European ambassador to both China and Japan, Hans-Dietmar Schweisgut. Thank you very much for being with us and for giving us your introductory remarks for today's sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few introductory words before this session. In 2019, the European Union, for the first time, made a qualification of China not only as a cooperation partner, as a competitor in economic terms, but as a systemic rival. This is a characterization which, of course, did not go down very well in Beijing. It came right before a rather difficult summit meeting, and it set the tone in a way for a relationship which has become increasingly difficult. Now, in the years that followed, we had, of course, the pandemic, Chinese support for Russia's invasion into Ukraine, and all that, of course, further diminished the scope for cooperation, and also led a year ago to a speech by Commission President von der Leyen, where she didn't mince words and came forward with a view of how EU relations with China could develop, which was increasingly dominated and focusing not only on trade issues and rebalancing market access, the traditional European concerns, but increasingly on economic security in a new geopolitical context, and obviously something which was also seen against the background of the deteriorating relationship between the United States and China over the past years. Now, I think it's useful to ask the question, how did we get to this point, and what is the outlook for the future relationship with China, and also for Europe's position in Asia, in the wider Indo-Pacific area. And if you look back for the last 10 years, it was not obvious that the relationship between Europe and China would necessarily deteriorate or not sort of be on an upswing, because at the beginning of Xi Jinping's term, there was a bit of uncertainty about the new leader, but basically the feeling was that European-Chinese relations were on a relatively positive trajectory. There was agreement on a very comprehensive agenda for cooperation leading up to the year 2020. There was also a very important document in 2013, which was issued at the so-called third plenum after the Party Congress, which gave an outlook for Chinese reform and liberalization, which led to a very positive assessment by the European business community and the impression that despite some backlashes, by and large, China would not only continue but reinforce its path on liberalization reform. There was also, of course, the very positive impression by China's support for the difficult situation Europe was in economically, support for Greece by buying Greek government bonds at the behest of the European Union, support for the European Stability Mechanism. At the summit 2015, China expressed an interest in participating in the so-called Juncker Fund, the Fund for Strategic Investment. There was an agreement even to cooperate more closely on 5G. In short, the outlook was one where both sides had the feeling that this is a forward-looking relationship. Now, the situation started to change in the following years, and I would suggest that the years between 2016 and 1920 were years of increasing frustration and irritation by the fact that the Europeans had the feeling that China was developing and moving in a way which was not really what the expectations really had been a bit earlier. First and foremost, of course, this related to the economic field, to trade relations. There was increasing frustration about the lack of market access. There was virtually no progress on the negotiations on an investment agreement. There was also the feeling that China is turning more mercantilist by its Made in China 2025 program, which clearly set out a vision of China becoming more independent of external technology, while at the same time making sure that China could control value chains for the outside. And then, of course, there was also the feeling that this China under Xi Jinping is becoming more repressive internally and more assertive, not to say aggressive externally. Tensions in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea with Japan, China's refusal to accept the arbitration award in 2016, which was asked for by the Philippines at the time. All this sort of created the impression that China is becoming not only a more difficult partner, but China is moving in a direction where it is not only suggesting that it has a different model of economic development, but a model of development which is increasingly in direct contradiction with European and Western interests. Now, this has not so much to do with the fact that the Europeans felt that the human rights situation was deteriorating, but more that the feeling was that we saw a China which moved not only in a different way than the Western world, but gradually more against it. And this led to the characterization which I pointed out in 2019. Now, there was still the expectation then that there should be a way to patch up the relationship by agreeing on the investment agreement. And there was an agreement, actually, in the last days of the German presidency of the Council at the end of 2020 to agree on that investment agreement. which of course was a bit unexpected because China had not moved for many years. So why did China move? And of course the assumption was China moved because this came just ahead of the inauguration of the new American president and was seen as a welcome opportunity for China to sort of move Europe a bit away from the transatlantic alliance. The agreement was not ratified for different reasons, because the European Union adopted the human rights instrument at the end of 2020, which was used early in 2021, including against China, when the European Union sanctioned a number of Chinese officials, which led to counter-sanctions, and the European Parliament made it clear that it would not ratify the agreement, especially since a number of its members had been sanctioned by China. Now, in the meantime, we had the pandemic, but what really changed, I think, the perception and also the relationship more fundamentally was, of course, Russia's war of aggression against the Ukraine. And there, of course, we came into a situation where there was also some hesitation in Europe. Is this a moment where we could still try to persuade China to step in and make its influence felt on Russia for a solution to the end of the war? But it became very quickly clear that this was a completely different game altogether. It was not about China being sort of a neutral observer. It became very clear, and had been before, that for China, Russia, of course, is an essential partner in its quest for an alternative world order. And therefore, this was not about China being neutral or moving to the Western side or upholding the principles of the United Nations, of which China is, of course, a permanent member of the Security Council. And that's a relationship which continues. Now, of course, in the meantime, we also have a situation partly caused by the Russian war of aggression, but partly caused also by the rivalry and increasing tension between the United States and China, which went way beyond the situation in Europe, Russia, and the Ukraine, which is basically a competition about supremacy in the Indo-Pacific and worldwide. And this also means that trade relations, economic relations, have increasingly been trumped by geoeconomics and geopolitics. And trade relations, in many respects, have become weaponized, a situation which also had its impact on Europe, which also led to the fact that the Europeans became aware that this was not only a difficult trade relationship with an unsustainable trade deficit, which almost reached 400 billion in 2022, but also a relationship where dependencies created vulnerabilities and sort of were a threat to the resilience of the European Union, and also in a way an impediment in its quest for the green and the digital transition without becoming too over-dependent on Chinese value chains and inputs. So the economic security strategy basically goes in two directions: strengthening the European competitive situation on the one hand, and on the other hand, also using defensive instruments and creating protection against Chinese overcapacity, which is threatening to flood the markets in areas such as electric vehicles, batteries, green technologies, and other areas, etc. So that's the situation basically we are in at the moment. The economic security strategy is something which is being discussed between the European institutions and member states. It's mostly a member state's competence, and I don't think we can expect sort of real progress in the month ahead before the European elections. So in many respects, not only in Europe, but also between the United States and China, we are a bit in a waiting situation before the elections also in the United States. Secretary of the Treasury Yellen was in China the day before yesterday and yesterday. Biden and Xi Jinping had a phone call a couple of days ago, which suggested that this is not going to relaunch a new era of cooperation. It's more basically an attempt to stabilize the situation in a political situation where no side has an interest in seeing things escalating. For the European Union, the way ahead, I think, is on the one hand to be more clear-eyed on China, to be able to use its defensive interest to protect its interests. On the other hand, to make sure that we keep the channels of communication open. A power like China is not one which you can just put to the side. China remains an indispensable partner, and it remains a power which will continue to shape the world, whether we like it or not. But I think we are in a much more coherent position than we were a couple of years ago. And even though member states are not always singing from the same hymn sheet, I think there's much more cohesion than I experienced during my time as European ambassador in Beijing. On the other hand, I think the European Union has also been relatively successful in its outreach to other partners, Japan first and foremost, Korea, in the Indo-Pacific. I think one thing which, in my view, should happen in the years ahead is to make sure that we don't really go forward on separate strands with a China strategy on the one hand and an Indo-Pacific strategy which was adopted 2 years ago, which barely mentions China and creates a bit the impression that the European policy is pursuing different policy areas where in reality they are linked. And obviously this is also linked to the fact that the European Union sees the security situation in Asia, in the Pacific, in a different light after February 2022, also because the Asians see it in a different light. Japan would not have as unequivocally supported the Ukraine against Russia had it not realized that this obviously has an impact also on the security situation in Asia, in the situation around Taiwan. And if you look at the sort of changing and shifting areas of cooperation and alliances with the Japanese Prime Minister and the Philippine President going to Washington in a few days' time, you see that this is still something which is a very volatile situation where the European Union cannot simply say, we want everybody to support us on Ukraine, but sorry, we don't have the means and the capacity and the will to make quite clear that a unilateral change in the situation around Taiwan would be anything else but completely unacceptable for the European Union. Thank you.
Ambassador Schweisgut, thank you so much for introducing us to this extremely insightful but also very elaborate topic that we're going to discuss further today, for painting the picture and preparing the floor for our panel discussions, and in particular for giving us this very comprehensive overview of the evolution of China-EU relations, and especially the focus on trade as a geoeconomic, geostrategic factor, and the necessity to keep open lines and channels of communication also in the future. Dear ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panel discussion today, which, as mentioned before, bears the title The Strategy Mosaic, Transformations in the EU-China Relations and Policies. We have three excellent speakers, and I'd like to introduce them to you now in the order of their appearance. First of all, António Martins da Cruz, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Portugal, will be joining us, also the chairman of IPLI. Please, sir, you can already take your seat at the panel. Then we have with us Ms. Alicja Bachulska, Policy Fellow for the European Council on Foreign Relations, the Warsaw office. You're working from Poland. And also at the same time, Alicja is research fellow with the China observations in Central and Eastern Europe. And our third speaker for today is Matej Šimalčík. He joined us from Bratislava. He is the director of the Central European Institute for Asian Studies and also a senior associate at a Bratislava-based law firm. So thank you very much to the three of you for being with us today, for discussing this very important topic, especially vis-a-vis the points that have already been raised by Ambassador Schweisgut in his introductory remarks. We will be discussing EU-China policies and strategies and how they have been evolving up until today, pointing out that they're not static, but they are quite fluid and also, of course, dependent on geoeconomic and geopolitical developments. We will probably briefly outline changes that we have seen ever since 2019, the EU strategy that we all remember, this trifold approach from competitor to rival to partner, which has, of course, shifted in the most recent past. And we will be taking a look also at current and future economic and diplomatic relations vis-a-vis China, basically to paint that mosaic that probably consists out of 27 different pieces, but maybe we will see a more holistic, more comprehensive total picture of looking at that mosaic from afar. And this is the question that I'd like to start with, and without any further ado, I'd like to hand over Ambassador Cruz to your words. Please, each speaker has roughly 10 to 15 minutes. 10 to 15 minutes introductory remarks, and then we will go to a open questions and answers round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your views on the relations of European Union in China. Probably those who were in the seminar this morning already know what I'm going to say, but I will repeat it. Some years ago, my friend Pascal Lamy wrote an article entitled "An Isolated China is a More Dangerous China." In it, and among other things, he described how, and I quote, "isolating China further would be a mistake," end of quote. And furthermore, that a globalized China is less dangerous for Europe and the rest of the world than an autarkic China. I agree with Pascal Lamy's clear position. I would like to analyze them within the context of the economic relations currently prevailing between Europe and China and the respective political environment. Some economic facts framing our China relationship. China, as you know, is the second largest economy in the world. In 2023, its GDP in current US exchange rate, it came to 17.7 trillion of US dollars, with the US in front with 26.8. Furthermore, China is already the world's largest economy in PPP, the accounting criteria applied by Eurostat to classify European Union member states, for example. Trade in goods and service of European Union in China totalized 960 billion euros in 22. That means 2.64 billion euros a day. Last year, in 23, there was a drop of 3% in exports from Europe against 18% fall in imports from China. But trade nevertheless reached 737 billion euros. That means 2.01 billion euros a day. In 2023, China was Europe's largest supplier, providing 20.5% of total imports outside Europe and the third largest buyer, taking 9% of total European exports. Exports already account for a fifth of China's GDP, and China's share of global manufacturing goods stands in the world at 31%. The EU ran a large trade deficit with China in goods, but registered a surplus both in services and FDI, the foreign investment, foreign direct investment. The EU depends to a greater extent on trade with China than the US. Its imports and exports of goods of Europe with China represents 5.4% of our GDP against 2.7% of US GDP. And just an example, a country neighbor of Austria, Germany exports more to China than France, Italy, and UK together. Final example, in terms of critical investment in renewable energy technology, that means wind turbines, photovoltaic panels, between 20 and 22, China market share of EU green product imports surged from 11 to 41%. China's share of the same market with the United States advanced from 13 to 19% over the same period. The European relations with China is essential and crucial for both parts in political and economic terms. But relationship is nevertheless asymmetrical across Europe, depending on different situations and different positions of member states. This relationship is now politically controversial with different positions, as I told you, of European member states, and with Europe subject to political pressures from the United States. China is also becoming an unavoidable political and economic partner in markets who are very important for some European countries, like Africa and Latin America. In 2019, the ambassador already referred us, the European Union approved a strategic position defining China simultaneously as a partner for economic cooperation and negotiation, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. What that means? As a partner, Europe has to attain a balance, fine-tuning the defense of its interests, and maintaining an open relationship with fluid diplomatic dialogues. As a competitor, China is entering European markets primarily in technological areas, but however, Europe also wants to do business in the Chinese market. And as a systemic rival, China has alternative political and strategic means and does not follow the political system and the norms, especially in human rights, of European governments. The European perceptions of China, of relations with China, may vary from a country to another in Europe. While this is clear reflects the economic relations ongoing, it also clear cannot be separated from geostrategic objectives, political constraints, memories of history, and the alternatives available for different Europeans. China needs European markets just as various European countries need the Chinese market. And while China needs Europe, the European geopolitical alternative depends on its difficult dialogue with the United States about China. Even after the San Francisco summit a couple of months ago, this dialogue between the United States and China does not yet seem to have established, with so much depending on the US elections on the next 5 November. Electoral political cycles also influence relations with China. In fact, China, like Ukraine or Gaza, has entered in the US election campaign. and this is never a positive development in terms of foreign policy. The aim of the foreign policy, any foreign policy, should be the defense of each country's national interests, not the electoral circumstances. However, the US is hardly the only example in these incursions. What is the European perception of China? This certainly differs from Lithuania to Austria or to Portugal, for example. The history and the historic relationships with China certainly influence this perception. A country, what is China? What is the perception of China for European stakeholders? A country with an economic model on Western markets, with its own rules, and especially since Deng Xiaoping. A one-party political model, classed as an authoritarian model, more Leninist than Marxist, in which probably the Emperor Mandarin's pyramidal tradition was replaced by the rigid structure of the Chinese Communist Party organization. A country that is a civilization more than a culture, that is 3,000 years old, and where Confucianism maintains its tradition and still inspires some policies in China. In its most recent political developments under President Xi Jinping, security has seemed to condition and guide the post-pandemic economic recovery of China. Just as in the West, national security was been imposing increasing constraints in our economies. According to Washington, in a position that some European leaders follow, Beijing will become the main rival of political and strategic terms in the coming years. However, the conflict in Ukraine was once again brought Russia to the fore, especially now when we are celebrating the 17th anniversary of NATO. China moves regarding Taiwan, and this eventual return to the mainland could determine the future policy model of Western states towards China. I believe that the large majority of the Europeans will condemn any move of China to change the current situation. And probably the US will press Europe to follow Washington to prevent a military Chinese solution. Ukraine could be a good example for similar situation to be followed by Europeans. A few European countries, especially France and UK, are particularly concerned with China's position in the Pacific, following the USA in this strategic question. One of the US goals is securing the Indo-Pacific zone from Chinese influence. How Cruz and the alliance with Japan, South Korea, and Philippines are several of the US answers to the tensions with Beijing, mainly in the Pacific and the South China Sea. With this realization, and in keeping with the prevailing economic reality and geopolitical situation, Europe's responses to the Chinese challenge remain hesitant. Firstly, European Union advocates decoupling. That means turning away from China, Chinese trade and investment whenever Europe's strategic security, economic and geopolitical interests are at stake. This was the same position of the United States. Given the vagueness of its overall interests and disagreement between member states, the UN changed and advanced the criteria of de-risking. That means limiting vulnerabilities in strategic sectors like minerals, semiconductors, solar panels, turbines, and electric cars. This rather reflects an attempt to protect against high risks to the economy and not only to the security of Europe. Europe encounters constraints in this de-risking format. First of all, its vagueness. Second, the differing perceptions of different countries of Europe as the concept, its definition, security policies, and economic dynamics are national and not Europeans. For example, the diversity of behaviors and decision regarding the presence of Chinese companies in different European markets. For instance, the case of Huawei and the G5 market. Furthermore, Europe economic growth depends more on foreign markets than the American growth does. And Europe has fewer natural resources than the US, and its supply chains are already more deeply integrated with the Chinese economy than those of the US. These policies are fostering distortions in the Europe-China market, and with European business losing out some opportunities in Chinese market. The replacement of some supply chains and the adoption of friendshoring and nearshoring projects are providing difficult and above all making products more expensive with possible political consequences in economic, social and electoral terms in European countries. Europe probably needs more cohesion or more common positions in future relations with China. Sometimes Europe seems divided. Let's hope that after European elections in June, the new European institution manage to facilitate that cohesion. As regards China, the US and the European Union, to some extent, are weaponizing their economies. That is, deploying the economy as a weapon of tool of war. China trade surplus and market distortions fail to explain anything. Brussels claim the measures are not directly aimed to China, but the Chinese interests that are the most affected by the rules on investment screening, misuse of state aid, the lack of reciprocity, and the anti-coercion instrument. However, one holds the impression that Chinese leaders are primarily concerned with the United States. And in Beijing, EU-China relations are often analyzed through the prism of China-US relations. Chinese diplomacy holds a clear interest in emphasizing the difference between Europe and America, and to deepen those differences and to raise their visibility. As far as the European Union is concerned, Chinese diplomacy prefers to deal separately with European countries instead of European institutions, mainly the Commission, both in political and economic issues. All of this contributes to tensions in both sides of the Atlantic over how to deal with China. The EU and the US do take different positions in keeping with asymmetries on the European side and somewhat fluctuating on the American side, mainly due to partisan electoral campaign. Europe's main concern over China is behavior. The US' main concern about China is power. But China is likely to expand as twice the rate of the United States in the years ahead. Nevertheless, China does still seek to preserve the European and American market it needs, sometimes deployed specific responses in the case of Europe. For example, placing limitations on the import of cognac in retaliation for French restrictions on Chinese imports. However, the Chinese response emerged more specifically in two other fields, the financial and the geopolitical. China is seeking to reduce its vulnerabilities by defending financial security through developing alternatives to dependence of the US dollar for international trade and energy imports. Beijing's strategy involves striving to broaden usage of the renminbi while seeking out alternatives in financial system to position the country to dispense the US dollar. On the other hand, by promoting the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS, China is seeking to frame and optimize its diplomatic, economic, and military actions in the Global South. The objective is not only to develop a non-dollar-based economic and financial system, but also, for strategic reasons, to ensure a strong bilateral presence in these countries of the so-called Global South, against West and Europe interests or at the expenses of these interests. Just a few conclusions before.
Probably we can go to the conclusions because I will have certainly one round of questions, but thank you very much for now for your very elaborate, thank you very much, statement. Because I would definitely like to also leave some time for questions and answers from our audience. However, with no further ado, Alicja, would you like to also raise a couple of points and give us your statements, especially vis-a-vis a couple of the points that we probably have heard already now from Ambassador Cruz, and maybe keeping in mind also of the time. Thank you very much.
Mind if I sit here?
No, not at all, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And I think that I'll try to be very brief because the points I'm trying to make, I think, are quite simple in a way. And I do agree that the landscape, especially the economic landscape that Mr. Ambassador has just painted, is quite striking in a way that all these numbers that we're citing at the very beginning, they are very, very symptomatic of the place where we come from in our current shift when it comes to EU-China relations. And I think that it's very clear that the kind of policies, the pragmatic, the approach that we've called the pragmatic approach towards cooperation with China has, on the one hand, brought some European businesses and some economies huge profits. But at the same time, it has resulted in Europe becoming much more vulnerable to the impact of third actors, but also much less dependent on, or actually more dependent on China. But at the same time, I think that the point in time that we are right now at the moment, it is a kind of a shock therapy. We are going through a battle of perceptions. And I think that these perceptions are indeed very different depending on where you sit. And also, even within certain countries, there are still very diverging views. And here I think that, in my view, we need to catch up with the reality, or the reality will catch up with us. In other words, I do believe that, we're 2024. Economic interconnectedness does not guarantee stability. And obviously, we have economic benefits, and we have potentially huge gains if we look at the EU-China relations through the lens of business and the kind of business as usual that we've been looking at for the past 30 years. But I think that we also have mounting evidence that comes, on the one hand, from China domestically, but also from the kind of interactions China is having with third parties, such as Russia, in the context of the war in Ukraine. And I think that, one of the topics of this panel is the future of EU-China relations. And I think that what I'm going to say is going to be very simplistic, but it's for the sake of the clarity of my message. And the reality we're going to end up with is going to be probably much more complicated and somehow in between these two scenarios. But I think that, on the one hand, we have a vision of a radical reframing of the EU approach. And this radical reframing will come at a cost. But this cost would have to be firstly understood and calculated based on our strategic interests. And I do agree that national interests are very, very important. But we're talking about EU-China relations. None of the EU countries, as a nation state, has enough power to influence China in any way. We've seen the kind of developments in Chinese economy, military, domestic relations, societal level under Xi Jinping, and I think it would be very misleading to try to look at this reality through the lens of China before Xi Jinping, because I think we're facing a very different reality. And here I think that if we want to make these strategic choices at the level of the EU, we have to understand that there will be certain costs. But that's the reality where the EU wants to be economically competitive in the long run, safe because of the kind of reality we're seeing with potentially Trump becoming the new US president, but also with China and Russia standing back to back and supporting each other when it comes to the merging theaters on the Indo-Pacific and on NATO's eastern flank. So that's one scenario, the radical scenario, where we really sit at this table, and we're very, very far away from this scenario. But there might be a need for such a scenario to at least try to, intellectually even imagine a united EU when it comes to taking these costs. But there is also another scenario that is that the EU wants to just get by and maintain the status quo in a world that does not really look at, the status quo as we like to imagine it. So, of course, we can continue engaging with China economically and trying to maintain business as usual, because there is still a lot of potential benefit to be gained from such an approach. But I think that this is an approach that will be increasingly dictated by China. And in the strategic, if we want to have a strategic approach, and even given different national EU countries' national interests, here I think that we need to understand that this is very unsustainable. And, as I said, this will be a combination in the future of these two kinds of strains of thought that are developing in different countries in the EU, fighting and clashing. And there are so many domestic and external factors that will influence the outcome of this competition. And I do agree that we have very diverging views. I think that, for example, if you look at the Baltic states, if you look at Czechia, at Poland to a certain degree, there is a growing mindset where people do tend to look beyond EU and business as usual. So that's not the core interest. We're looking at something much bigger and a much bigger reframing of the international order. And there is the so-called old EU, with France and Germany having their very particular interests and the clashes between business elites and political elites. But I think that this reframing is going on, but the sense of urgency is not yet there at the level of all 27 EU member states. So I think that the choice now is about us as the EU, as a whole institution and community, trying to understand whether we are able and willing to bear certain costs, or if we're willing to be sidelight completely on the international arena, given the kind of changes we're seeing at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicja, for also your remarks and for keeping it very blunt and very precise. I do not think that it was simplistic. I think it was very frank and outspoken, and probably we can touch upon a couple of issues and points that you've mentioned also later in the discussion. But before that, I'd like to hand over also to our third speaker, Matej Šimalčík. From your perspective, probably also touching upon what Alicja has said, are we seeing from your Central Eastern European perspective also that sense of urgency?
Thanks, Michael, for inviting me and for giving me the floor this evening. I have the lucky spot of being the last on the panel, so I can cherry pick what I want to say without the need to overlap with what was said before. Maybe let me preface my introduction with a little bit of a polemic with what was said before about isolated China being a more dangerous China. I mean, yes, in principle, we can probably agree with that, but does that mean that we should engage China at all costs? What are the red lines where we will say, okay, engagement is not working, we need to change our approach? Who is isolating whom? Are we deliberately isolating China? Or is China isolating away from us? We've seen this in several maybe examples, that is maybe more of a self-isolation or attempts for one-way isolation of China away from the West, while it being still able to influence the West. A good example of that would be deliberate push against Western journalists in China, not making them able to report on what's going on in China anymore, making the conversations that we are having about China-Europe relations maybe a little bit more of a one-way street, because we are losing access to information, and China is doing that deliberately. Secondly, in terms of economy, neither US nor the EU invented decoupling or de-risking, or however we frame it. China invented it, and it goes by the name of dual circulation. It's a catchphrase that it's very hard to grasp, maybe, but this is what it means in its very core: de-risking away from other countries, while keeping its foot inside those other countries so that it can use those links to maybe pressure them, influence them, or however we want to call that. This has, of course, direct ramifications on how we are able to engage with China. In 2019, we had this wonderful EU trifecta introduced of China being a partner, competitor, and a rival. But when we have this kind of development, we need to ask again ourselves time and time again: is this description still valid? Is partnership something that is still maybe the core determinant, or have we moved to the times where it's more about being competitors and rivals, and partnership is becoming increasingly difficult? We like to say that we are partners with China on the issues related to climate change. Is China wanting to be a partner for us on climate change, or is it using to push us in other policy areas where it has more pressing interests? We've maybe seen examples of how this works in China's perspective when it comes to Sino-American relationship. One of the things that we've seen after the visit by Nancy Pelosi to Taipei was China freezing the climate dialogue with the US. Are we still able to have a partnership in these topics that we say are should be immune to politics because we have a joint interest in them, when China is deliberately using them to pressure policy change in other areas? So maybe we are more in this sort of competitor-rival stage of the relationship, while finding areas for partnership or dialogue are becoming increasingly difficult. Are we able to have a partnership sort of relationship with a country that is deliberately supporting Russia in a war of aggression in Ukraine, and therefore directly affecting our own security interests here in Europe? Coming from a border nation with Ukraine, Slovakia, this is something I think that's of a very high importance towards us. And I could go on with multiple examples of this. Nevertheless, we are at a stage where I think we will see, where there will be some breaking points in how the relationship will move in the coming years. Of course, we are very close to the EU elections that will have some sort of impact on how the relationship will be managed, on whether some of the new initiatives recently unveiled by the Commission will be implemented as how they are envisioned currently. In January, we've seen the new economic security package presented by the EU Commission, but ultimately it will be to the new EU Parliament to approve those measures. I think that we are not going to see such a fundamental change, maybe in how what will be the composition of the EU Parliament. The fundamental basis of the division of power there will remain more or less the same, I think. So we will probably see some continuity in what's been going on in the past term. Yet, of course, the relationship is not solely dependent on these developments in terms of EU elections. Domestic elections in member states play probably even a more important role in which way the EU will move, as common foreign and security policy is ultimately a member state game rather than the EU Parliament game. Good example would be Slovakia right now, where I'm coming from, right? We had presidential election over the weekend, which now we know the results of. But more importantly, we had parliamentary elections last fall, which brought in a change in power compared to the previous election term. And with that, despite China not being very high on the agenda of the election campaign, a fundamental shift in how we are approaching China on a bilateral basis. The same happened 3 years before that in 2020 when a more China-friendly policy was changed for a more Taiwan-friendly policy, much more China-critical policy, as a result of elections again. So we cannot pretend that that policies towards China within Europe are immune towards domestic politics, right? Even if they may not be discussed to such a high extent on within domestic politics clearly has impact. And so it ultimately is not going to be just the U.S. politics that impacts that relationship. When it comes to sort of other broader issues that will influence the relationship with China, it will still be largely influenced by what's going on in Ukraine and China's relationship with Russia. I think that's something that will play a very important role in determining or like making us understand how far can we go in pursuing engagement with China when it's actively supporting actors that are being aggressive and acting against our interests. The same goes towards China's positioning within its periphery, how it will be acting in the Taiwan Strait, and maybe more overlooked, but potentially even more risky scenarios within the South China Sea, where there's a far larger number of actors involved in the dispute, making it all the more unpredictable. This, of course, relates not just how EU is dealing with China, but with the whole Indo-Pacific region. And I very much liked what the ambassador said in the beginning, that we cannot divorce our China policy from our Indo-Pacific policy. Those are intimately interlinked. Of course, we cannot make decisions when it comes to bilateral relations with other states in the Indo-Pacific region solely as an extension of a relationship with China, but China is a factor in every one of those relations. We are talking about how to bring India on our side and remove it from the relationship with Russia. Well, India has a very difficult relationship with China. Maybe we need to discuss how to support India within our partnership, so that it feels that it's also supported in matters that matter to India. The same goes to the South China Sea littoral states, right? We see that this sort of troubled relationship with Russia or a troubled relationship with West in Indonesia as well. Again, a country that's directly involved in the South China Sea dispute. So these are some foods for thought to think about when we are discussing what lies in the future of the Europe-China relationship. I'll pause here because I think we'll have a lot of food for thought to be discussed later on in the questions.
For sure, thank you very much. It will be for sure also a pleasure for us to digest some of these food for thought further on. Before I open the floor for questions from the audience, I'd like to pose one question that can be also combined with your final remarks for this session here, for your final conclusion statements, one question probably to try to piece together the different perspectives, different elements that we've heard today in this first panel discussion, also linking back to what Ambassador Schweisgut has said in the beginning. Yeah, I mean, against the background of these increasing complexities, against the background of the increasing part of strategic rivalry, of increasing geoeconomic, geopolitical difficulties and complexities, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the growing tension in Taiwan and the cross-strait relations that we've heard of, the fact that we're in a shock therapy and that no one single member state is large or capable enough to face China on its own. If you would give one recommendation to the new composition of the European institutions after the elections now, whether we need more EU or more member states' perspective vis-a-vis China, what would be your answers?
Thank you very much. You know, it's a difficult question for one reason. As was mentioned here, for me and others, there are differences between the European countries in their approach to China. Many differences, because every country has a specific foreign policy. There is no a common foreign policy of Europe. There are some pieces of foreign policies accepted by all countries of European Union, but there is not an European foreign policy. And each country defends its own interests. For the future, after, because you put the question, after the European elections, let's see what will be the composition of the European Commission and the European Parliament. By the way, I have no time. I received today a report from the European Parliament, 109 pages about relations between Europe and China. I have no time for reading because I received it this afternoon. But anyway, that means that European institutions are preoccupied. But I would like to raise the attention for 2 or 3 very interesting things that was mentioned here. One about economic security. Economic security, we had the opportunity to underline this morning in our seminar, economic security is a question for national definition and not European definition. It's not on the treaties. So you change the treaties, or the European Commission can make recommendations, but every country is free to define its economic security policy. Second thing, you mentioned that China is supporting Russia in Ukraine. I'd like to underline that China is not providing any military supplies to Russia. And 4 Chinese companies supply Russia with dual-use technologies, civilian but can be used on military side, and they are already under sanctions by the European Union and the United States. And China was the first country who presented a peace plan project for the conflict in Ukraine, and most probably, if the Ukrainian conflict ends at the table of negotiations, as I expect and others expect, probably China could be one of the mediators. Probably in one side we'll have the United States, and in the other side the Chinese. So I would suggest that the approach on China on the Ukrainian conflict must be very carefully, because until now they support politically Russia on general terms, but they are not supplying military equipment to China. To come back to your question about the future of European relations, I can give you the example of my country that I mentioned this morning. The example of my country is very easy. We have relations with China since the 16th century. And we import from China the double we import from the United States, just to give you an example. China have important investments in Portugal, in energy, in production and distribution, in banking, assurance, and other investments.
Yeah.
We are the second country of Europe with more Chinese investment per capita. And why? Because when the Portuguese government a few years ago privatized these companies, the Chinese, for instance, for energy, offer 20% more than a German offer. So we sold it to the Chinese. Why not? We have no problems with this Chinese investment in Portugal. No problems at all. And that's why, and I come back to my first sentence, there are different approaches from member states of Europe to China, and this difference must be taken in consideration by the European institution after the election in order to try a cohesion of European position. But the common denominator must have in consideration every one of the 27 interests of the member states of Europe.
Yeah, I understand that. Thank you very much. This is certainly a very realistic approach to the question and the issue. Alicja, if you can give a recommendation to the European Commission or Parliament or both.
I think my recommendation would be that on all fronts, economic, diplomatic, people-to-people, climate change, whatever you call it, we need to face China as it is and not based on our own perceptions that might be influenced by you know, a certain level of projections that, you know, we wish China to be an actor that is responsible, as it claims it is, but we also have evidence of what it does. And here with the Russian example, I beg to disagree with Mr. Ambassador, because I do believe that you don't have to send conventional military equipment to support the war effort. And we're seeing China sending massively semiconductors, for example, to Russia, or buying Russian energy and effectively helping Russia to get over European Western sanctions and helping the whole war effort by supporting Russian economy. And the peace plan, well, if you read into the Chinese peace plan, is a reiteration of Russian strategic interests towards the war in Ukraine, which essentially is about reframing and reformulating the European security architecture so that it better reflects Russia's and China's interests in the overarching background of China-US rivalry. And to many European countries, this is fundamentally in disagreement with their national interests. So yeah, that's my conclusion.
So no wishful thinking and also being more realistic. Matej, please.
Yeah, I have to echo what was said by Alicja. Like, we cannot approach China with rose glasses, right? If it quacks like a duck, it's usually a duck. If it acts assertively, it is assertive by design. I also have to, say that I disagree with the characterization by the minister of the Russia-China relationship in light of Ukraine, and another concrete example of how China supports Russia that is far more related towards direct military support is sharing of intelligence information. geospatial intelligence, which allows Russia to conduct more precise missile strikes on Ukrainian territory. Besides the weapons exports, it doesn't really get much closer to direct military support than this. When it comes to recommendation on more member state versus more Europe, I think we definitely need to find ways how to have more Europe in dealing with China. Fragmentation of Europe is in China's interest. It allows it to, nitpick and cherry pick potential allies. We have plethora of evidence of how this is in China's favor based on its relationship with ASEAN, based on the decision-making processes in ASEAN, how it has always been able to find one actor here or there to, support China's position and in such way block joint response by ASEAN towards China's behavior. The same goes for the EU. The logic is comparable. When it comes to de-risking, for example, more Europe would be better because it allows us to bear the costs of de-risking much more efficiently. It means that we are able to find maybe new opportunities for European businesses to cooperate with other partners beyond China, like opening new opportunities for them, reinvigorating, for example, trade liberalization discussions with like-minded partners across the world. In order to make it precisely easier for European countries. And free trade is something that is definitely written in the founding treaties of the EU. So this is maybe the place where EU can play a very important role in mitigating economic risks related to China.
Yeah, thank you. We will have quick time for one quick round of questions, being mindful of the time. So please raise your hand, ask a precise, short question, introduce yourself. Yes, we have the first question here, and then number 2 here.
Thank you, Ms. Tabelli.
But please be short and precise.
Oh. So hello, and thank you for your discussion. And I am Sabina, and I'm from China. I'm right now working for the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime. I really appreciate your insights. So an interesting point that I observed is that when Ms. Alicja and Ms. Matej, your response to Ms. De Cruz comment, especially that comment that China has never give Russia direct military support. And your comment was, yes, disapprove that point. But I think what the point that Mr. Cruz tried to make, at least how I perceived, is the positive, at least the potential that China can play in the Russian-Ukraine war. And I think that is what we're trying to do and how diplomacy trying to march on. So based on this context, also some thought from my mind.
Yeah, can you please ask a specific question? We have time for some
that
more
is a setup for my
comments
question.
and discussion then also during maybe the wine reception. But do you have a precise
Thank
question?
you. So my question is that I see this disconnect between the actual reality. For example, the Scholz visits to China with all the business delegation or all the business economic ties. But on this ideological, I know China and Europe has totally different system, no matter politically or whatever. And I see this as a division. This difference is serving as a division. And from my point, we're all coming from a point of national interest, but national interests should incorporate global governance issues that should address this systemic difference. And I don't see any this kind of, I would not say accusation or this kind of points does not contribute to a positive side. So what would be your response? Sorry for my question being a bit lengthy.
Thank you. We have one more question, I think, here in the second row. But please, again, as mentioned, short and precise question so we can then have one more round of answers from our panelists.
Yep. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for today. And my name is Wallace, a student from the Vienna School of International Studies. And I would like to, my questions is like about places in China called Hong Kong. So since 2019, National Security Law and also the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance have passed in Hong Kong. Somebody claimed that it's a deterioration of democracies and European interests in Hong Kong. So in your opinion, would EU change their attitude to Hong Kong by saying there are no any differences between Hong Kong and China? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will go directly to answering these questions. Let's do it in reverse order. If you would like, Matej, to touch upon a couple of the points, is there anything that you'd like to add to what has been mentioned?
Yeah, sure. Let me maybe touch up on the issue of responsibilities for global governance and you know, how it relates to China-Russia relationship, Russian aggression in Ukraine, etc. I would not frame it whether China supports Russia or not as an ideological difference. I mean, ultimately, China subscribes to the UN Charter, and that spells out a clear role in preserving peace and stopping war of aggression by Russia. By supporting Russia at the UN, it is China is acting in a clear contradiction towards its obligations under the UN Charter, I think. So I mean, I would object to this sort of framing this as an ideological difference. Either we recognize that we have a shared commitment to the UN Charter, or we do not. I mean, this is what it boils down to. And if we do not, and if China isn't willing to recognize this as a clear obligation to uphold the UN Charter, then it clearly is how EU has been framing China, a systemic rival that wishes to see a very different system of global governance to emerge. And if that's the case, we do have we do have the right to object to that and prevent that sort of erosion of global system based on norms to which China has subscribed in the past.
Thank you. Alicja.
I agree. I'm not sure I've understood the second question about Hong Kong, but just to follow up on what Matej said, if I understood correctly also the first input. So I wouldn't also frame China-Russia relations and the way they're received in Europe through ideological lenses, mostly, because for us, sitting here, especially for people coming from countries on NATO's eastern flank, this is basically an existential, like Russia's behavior is an existential threat. And this kind of evidence, although it does not have to subscribe to, you know, the traditional understanding of military support, nevertheless constitutes an element adding up to the perception that China is helping Russia. And that's our fundamental security interest. And you know, that's how it is perceived by many countries here in this region. And I think that you can, like Li Hui's visit to Europe for the second time has been very a good example of, you know, how this view was reiterated throughout Europe. So I think that this is not it is not an ideology driven question. It is a question of security, basically. And China, with its holistic national security approach in recent years, should very well understand, you know, why security matters.
Thank you. Ambassador La Cruz, you have the last word, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, the problem of Russia, I believe I already mentioned what are the position. China is, of course, respecting the UN Charter, and it's not only China who support Russia in the United Nations, but a lot of countries of the Global South who say, and it's very clear, they told in public, and they told it to me, several ministers of African countries, for instance, that the Ukraine conflict is an European conflict they have nothing to do with. And China, this is the real politic. It's not elaboration about what is the the position in the United Nations is the following. Just follow the vote in the United Nations, the vote in the General Assembly, which, by the way, decisions of the General Assembly are not mandatory, as you know. I believe that the position of China when they present the principles for the peace, it's not a peace plan, are the principles for the peace, China refused the occupation of territories of Ukraine. It's very clear in the Chinese paper, for instance. As far as the Hong Kong security is concerned, I don't know, I was in Hong Kong 10 days ago, but I can talk about Macau. I was in Macau a couple of weeks ago also, and I don't feel any security problem in Macau. On the contrary, Macau is receiving 35 million tourists per year. We don't saw any security problem in Macau. Probably there are security problems in Hong Kong. I don't know. I'm not following Hong Kong. But I know one thing. By the way, I was invited by the British government. I was in the ceremony of the handover of Hong Kong in July 97. July 97. Yeah, that's right. And according to the joint declaration UK signed with China, Hong Kong returned to China in July 47. And of course, situation of 97 will not be the same until 47. There is an evolution. At least I saw the evolution in Macau. And probably there is the same evolution in China, evolution in Hong Kong, evolution from the Chinese government, evolution from different stakeholders in Hong Kong, like in Macau, and the evolution of the world. So one cannot think that the situation is static since the signature of the joint declaration until the final integration of the special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau to the mainland. No. There is an evolution. I can speak for Macau. The evolution is a normal one. I don't know in Hong Kong. We saw a lot of things in the press. I can tell you, I was in the streets of Hong Kong 10 days ago, last week, and I saw any problem. Probably there are problems in some groups in Hong Kong, but not in the common day-by-day life.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions anymore at this point. However, we will have a wine reception after the second panel discussion where you can also engage with our speakers. But first of all, a big round of applause to our three excellent speakers for your remarks. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, which brings me directly to the second round that we have prepared for you today. Thank you. I think that it will be possible to take the seats again in the first row. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, we will come to a very specific topic now that is also related to the first panel that we have had already, moving from the question about the strategy mosaic between the different strategies, the different approaches in EU-China relations to a very specific question, a question if and whether the European Union in the role of the EU in East Asian stability and security is that of a spectator or is that of a facilitator. And therefore, let me introduce our two panelists for that wonderful discussion that we have prepared for you now. First of all, Gudrun Wacker, Senior Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Ms. Wacker, please join us on stage. She also represents the EU at the ASEAN Regional Forum for several years. And our second speaker is Zsuzsa Ferenczy, Assistant Professor at the National Daohuan University in Taiwan, in Hualien, if I remember correctly, and also affiliated scholar at the Free University of Brussels. Thank you very much to the both of you for joining our discussion today, for joining us at that second part, the second panel discussion. We have prepared a couple of questions to basically set the scene for you, which is the extended nature of EU's current security engagement in East Asia, the relevance basically also for the European Union, the relevance of the East Asian region for European security. We would definitely love to hear your perspectives on that, and also the question of new partners, new military presences and engagements with the region, and of course also the question whether or not the European Union is a normative power as well in the East Asian region. So please, Gudrun, Wacker, would you like to start with your introductory remarks, and then we'll move to you, Zsuzsa. Thank you.
I hope this works because I took it off because my ears are too big or something. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be back in Vienna. I wanted to start first with saying something about the background of the European security engagement in the region. And I'm not only talking about the EU here, but also about the member states or several member states. I think the EU, it's fair to say, was pretty late in the game. We were not very engaged in the security issues in the region. There was a brief time when I think the European Union was part of Keynote, which was supposed to deliver coal to North Korea after an agreement was reached, but that fell through, so after that, not much. So the first paper we actually see coming out of the European Union was in 2006, I believe, and it was not even published, focused very much on Northeast Asia, not on East Asia, not to mention the Indo-Pacific. So we are very late in the game, and I think that it's fair that to say that the European approach was very much dominated by China, the bilateral relationship with China, and also the global partnership that we still cling to today by saying that on climate change, biodiversity, disarmament, questions like that, global issues, China can still be a partner. But we ignored the situation in the region where China became more and more assertive, and we basically watched the South China Sea, I would say, falling into the hands of China with a very clever tactic of taking a little bit, taking another little bit until there was a point of no return. And the second dimension of the EU's engagement with the region, I would say ASEAN was very much the focus, because it's the only organization in the region that halfway resembles the European Union. So we supported ASEAN, and I believe we still pay for part of the ASEAN Secretariat until this very day. So this was basically the two dimensions. There was China, bilateral, global, and ASEAN as the regional organization. And I would say the relationship with Japan or South Korea was rather secondary in political terms, at least. The only two countries in the European Union, one of them is not even a member anymore, that were engaged in hard security issues are France and the UK. France, for obvious reasons, because it still has its overseas territories in the South Pacific, New Caledonia, some islands, so it goes from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the Americas, basically, where France considers itself to be a resident power, in contrast to all other European member states who have simply no assets there. So France has some military assets there. And the UK because of its past colonial possessions like Hong Kong, but also the UK maintained a garrison in Brunei, which was funded by is funded by the Sultan of Brunei, not by the UK. But they also have still the Five Powers defense arrangements, where they hold military exercises with Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand, I believe. So these are the two countries that stick out. They also happen to be permanent members in the UN Security Council, and therefore, by nature, have a different outlook than a country like Germany, that until recently didn't even admit that we have national interests at all. The EU itself became a member in many of the regional organizations, the ARF, all the second track organizations that are there, but the aspiration to become a member, full member of the East Asia Summit was never fulfilled, even after the expansion of the East Asia Summit to include the US and Russia. We fulfill the requirement. The EU signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, but there is too much resistance within the East Asia Summit to admit the EU. So this is what we see until 2016. Ambassador Schweisgut mentioned the ruling from The Hague on the South China Sea. I have to say this was one of the weakest statements I have ever seen coming out of the EU. You cannot even say it supported the ruling from The Hague. But since then, there has been a shift, and I would also point to the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, again, I underline everything that Ambassador Schweisgut said about this sort of separation of China strategy on the one hand and Indo-Pacific on the other hand. But I think at the time there was still very much effort to present an Indo-Pacific strategy that does not look like it's directed against China, because up to that point, Indo-Pacific, the concept of the Indo-Pacific was very much associated with the Quad, Australia, Japan, US, and India. Thank you. And so it was seen by China as something very anti-Chinese. So I think this explains why we are very modest. And if you look at the German guidelines, they hold back even more. China and the US are only mentioned in the context that we are concerned about the growing rivalry or something like that. I have to say I'm positively surprised that even after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, the EU and the member states that have signed up to this Indo-Pacific strategy have kept up their activities. So we are deploying some limited military assets in the region. France has done this for many years consistently. They participate in joint military exercises with countries. The UK recently sent an aircraft carrier group. And I want to mention the Dutch because they cleverly joined the UK mission. So the Netherlands know they are a small country, but they don't have a problem with joining other nations. And I think this is what we need more in the EU. Germany, after more than 20 years, sent a first frigate to the region. But I still would say what we are doing there is very, very limited. It's more symbolic. It's showing the flag. It's sort of trying to signal to China that we are for the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, for upholding international law. But if push comes to shove, we will not be there. That's as clear as glass. So I think we cannot raise expectations in the region about what we can accomplish. There is one dimension where we always had an impact on hard security in the region, and that is arm transfers. Only we don't talk about it at the EU level because this doesn't fall under the EU mandate at all. And France, for example, Germany is now talking about arms exports to India. And we have stepped up our diplomatic efforts very much. My country now has a 2+2 format with Japan and with Australia, a full-fledged security dialogue with Vietnam and Malaysia. So the diplomatic engagement is there, but we have to be realistic about what we can do in terms of military deployment. So in sum, I would say we're more an onlooker. We can every now and then show up and, show the flag. But again, you have differences between the different member states and how far they go. French go through the Taiwan Strait. Germans avoided it like the devil. But it's better than not being present at all. And very shortly on the question of the EU as a normative power, I think the response from the region to the Russian invasion of Ukraine shows that, yes, in abstract, we can all agree on the rules-based order, and rules are better than no rules. But the only ASEAN country that clearly condemned Russia in ASEAN, among the ASEAN states, was Singapore, with unilateral sanctions, and the rest sort of, wavered around, said the question is too complex, or Russia does nothing else than the US has done many, many times before. So I don't think that in that regard we have a big impact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your sober outlook and for your analysis, Gudrun Wacker, especially also giving us a very precise overview on the military capabilities of European countries, EU member states in the region, and of course also their limits.
Maybe I can say one sentence on Taiwan because it will sort of lead to Zsuzsa. Yeah. I think there I see a good development that at least in the media and in the political discussions there is much more awareness. And to come back to the Hong Kong thing, I think again the EU has had a very disappointing response to what is going on in Hong Kong, including the UK. It was very, very, very weak and immediately business as usual again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. However, also here, based on what you have said before, I do hear that the EU is taking more the role of a spectator, of an observer, than a proactive facilitator. However, moving along, Zsuzsa, Ferenczy, thank you very much also for being with us. Due to the fact that you're an assistant professor at the Donghua University in Taiwan, based in Taipei, probably you can also give us your perspective, the discussions that you're having with colleagues in Taipei on how the European Union and the engagement is perceived from the Taipei perspective.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the audience for being here, and also to the Institute and your team and your colleagues for having us here. It is good to be in Vienna to discuss EU, China, and Taiwan and Indo-Pacific issues. It's not the scene that I'm most often in terms of Europe, because it's usually the Brussels bubble, and then comes Berlin and Paris, and then come Central Eastern Europe, a region that I also come from. So it's good to be here, and it's also good to have you set the stage for me in terms of the regional dimension, and perhaps I'll zoom in, as you mentioned, that I am based in Taiwan. I've been there since 2020, so that has given me the opportunity to kind of get an inside view. I have not lived my entire life there, so I don't claim to know Taiwan inside out, But I do have and take pride in having invested recent years in understanding Taiwan better from a European perspective, but also perhaps trying to get a better idea of China through a Taiwan lens. I think that's also very valuable. And I think as I work on EU-Taiwan relations, I think the nuance often is missing from the debates we have. So I'll try to bring a little bit of a nuance also to the discussion. So what I would like to do is to look at Taiwan's role and geostrategic relevance in the Indo-Pacific through perhaps the outcome of the elections that Taiwan had in January, and look at the implications, then transition to EU-Taiwan relations in the larger context, and then zoom out and link a little bit to what Gudrun already laid out. But before I do that, I think it's also interesting to kind of dwell a little bit on the question that you framed in this panel, whether the EU is a facilitator or a spectator. And as nothing is black and white in life, I think I will not choose either or. But the way I would address that question is to say that Europe is adjusting, and I'm using that word very deliberately because I do not want to say that Europe is reacting only, because I think we're doing more than just reacting. I think we are adjusting to a new reality in the Indo-Pacific, also a new geopolitical landscape, and that means addressing economic vulnerabilities and looking for partners and in the Indo-Pacific. And obviously that already helps me to bring Taiwan into the picture, but it's not only Europe that is adjusting. Taiwan is adjusting to a changing China, and also the entire region is adjusting to a changing China. So what does this mean for Europe is to align our trade policy with national security interests. This was already laid out also in the previous panel. That's essentially economic security. So linking this is what we're doing. Now, whether this works in reality, that's the next question to ask. But I think that's a clear ambition that we have. And I think our approach to the Indo-Pacific has an assertive, according to many, it's more an aggressive China, but also Taiwan as a partner. So that you see the kind of contrast we have in the European perception. I think you might agree with me on this. I hope that this is sort of the emerging perception of Taiwan. And so we are transitioning, I think, from being more passive to being more active. I'm very mindful what this is in the narrative and how this plays out in reality, because there is this dilemma of ambition versus reality, and also a dilemma of perception versus self-perception. Because I think in light of what we've seen happen in the past 3-4 years, or perhaps a little more, and also when we ask the question of what is the EU, what does the EU think of itself, and what is the EU seen as being more a spectator or a facilitator. And I think a lot of what the EU has articulated in its narrative is, a lot of it is based on self-perception, being a geopolitical power, and being a normative power. No, I don't mean to undermine or sort of discredit the substance that there is a normative power attraction that the EU has, but I think the self-perceptions play an interesting role in how we look at Europe. And again, that allows me, that distance that I have from Europe now, being in Taiwan, I say this based on my discussions with, not just with Taiwanese counterparts, but also because I have more access and direct access to the region, Southeast Asia. So Europe is elevating its commitment to the region, and also it's elevated itself to the geopolitical actor role. Again, that's the self-perception. But again, I think we can talk about self-perception also in the case of Taiwan, and how that self-perception has changed in light of Taiwan's profile globally, how it has increased in the past, again, 3-4 years, more with COVID, and how Taiwan managed the pandemic, and also Taiwan's participation and proactive participation in the relief effort for Ukrainian refugees, and also aligning itself with international sanctions, European sanctions on Russia. So the dilemma of ambition versus reality is there, and Europe is positioning itself in the region as a global actor that is capable and willing to both. I have questions about both, but that is the ambition. And then when we look at the reality, of course, we have the reality of a fragmented Europe, a divided Europe that does not align, member states not align on China. Perhaps we have a more united Europe in light of the united approach we had to respond to the Russian aggression, but that does not translate into a united approach on China, clearly. So just to add another layer to Facilitator or Spectator, I came across HRVP Borrell's speech that he gave in 2023 in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue, when he said that Europe is a smart enabler, quote unquote, or at least, again, that's the ambition, investing in shared security in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. So much on, I guess we can sit here and dissect all these terms, but I think it's useful to shed light on the dimensions. And so to transition now to Taiwan in this context, and perhaps as I mentioned, I start with the elections that happened and how I observed the importance of those elections. And I think one of the outcomes, directly obvious outcome, was that there were no big surprises, no big winners, no big losers. And I think democracy was definitely a winner, or is definitely a winner in Taiwan's elections, because we see with every election, Taiwan's democratic institutions, culture, perceptions strengthen, and that is always a problem for Beijing. The DPP, the party that has been in power for the past 8 years, will continue for the next term under Lai Ching-te. And this is the party that Beijing has refused to have dialogue with for the past 8 years. So that's what we will be dealing with. And I also think that the victory of Lai Ching-te in itself doesn't raise the risk of war. I believe that it is the process, it is this strengthening Taiwanese identity. On top of that, a strengthening profile for Taiwan globally is what is a problem, and would be a problem even if not a DPP president would have won, but a KMT or perhaps a TPP president. So just mindful of time, I think I'll just go quickly through what we can expect from Lai. I think he ran as a candidate of continuity. I think he will be a a president rather of continuity. And he's put forward different priorities in particular, to build up Taiwan's deterrence, economic security. Again, I think all of this is very much in line with Taiwan's partners and friends around the world that think alike, trying to describe or to avoid the like-minded term without using it, but I still have to say that on a lot of things we do think alike, obviously, in this sense. So number 3 is to form partnerships, and number 4 is to have steady and principled cross-strait leadership. And so what can we expect from Beijing? I think it's also continuity, in the sense of no compromise on Taiwan, no dialogue, and definitely not in the near term, and no de-escalation, really. I think the pressure campaign that really intensified the months, weeks, days before the elections in terms of cyber attacks. According to Taiwanese official numbers, there were 20 to 40 million cyber attacks a month. On a normal month, that's usually 10 to 15 million. So that's just to use some figures. And I think, again, perceptions versus self-perception in the case, or in the cross-strait context. I'm using a quote from current President Tsai Ing-wen. She said, "If someone were to ask me what my legacy for Taiwan is, I would say that I am leaving behind a Taiwan of the world." And I think this, and the quote here, I think this is kind of the overall embraced perception, self-perception inside Taiwan. I think it has given the Taiwanese people a sense of relief, perhaps, and pride that they are being seen more than before, but clearly, limitations remain. And if we put that in contrast with a quote I'm using from an official Chinese source, is that Taiwan is China's Taiwan, period. So that's the situation. So transitioning to, just checking the time, I'm transitioning to EU-Taiwan relations from there. I think, in my view, I think there is a new reality in this relationship. And I would describe that in different ways. I think there is definitely more awareness of Taiwan's geostrategic importance to Europe's own security and prosperity. And that is a language that is on a European level. Again, Europe is 27 countries, so I am not projecting that as being embraced all over, but there's more awareness. There's also, there's more clarity in the European discourse on Taiwan. There's more assertive language and more pushback. And these three, I guess, go hand in hand in the sense that I feel that there are clear boundaries to where we are with China and where we are with Taiwan, as far as I'm concerned, right? In the sense that the EU has a clear, well, I say clear, but perhaps the problem has been that it hasn't been so clear in the past. I think now we are entering a stage where there's more clarity about the fact that the EU recognizes the PRC as the sole legal government of China, and we have diplomatic relations with the PRC. We do not with Taiwan, but we have the right to cooperate with Taiwan as a partner. Taiwan is an economy that, not to mention, responsible for producing 92% of advanced semiconductors. The other 8% come from Korea, so that's 100% of advanced semiconductors that the world depends on, and China also likes to receive those semiconductors, not the most advanced. So we do, I think, we have shifted into seeing Taiwan through a security lens as well, so that it's not only Taiwanese democracy that matters from the perspective of values and norms and normative power in the sense, but it's also very much an issue that touches directly on our national or European interests. And this is not a new situation, but a new awareness. This is what I mean. So Taiwan in its region, I think, and I think I should be coming to an end here, but just to finish on a regional point here, that as much as we look at Taiwan from a European perspective, I think this is a two-way street. Yeah. So Taiwan has its own agency to exercise. I think we should not have this conversation about Taiwan, but we need to have this conversation with Taiwan, and I'm trying to do that in Taiwan, but I think in Europe we need more conversations with Taiwan around European tables. And I think that Taiwan is also reciprocating, capitalizing on that, not just vis-a-vis Europe, but also countries in the region. And that is Japan, sharing similar concerns, but also ASEAN is a very important partner. Since 2016, Taiwan has a new southbound policy that looks at Southeast Asian countries plus 6 in the region, including Australia, New Zealand. And in that context, again, for those countries, seeing growing tension in the region, Taiwan's importance has increased, given that, and I'm looking at figures here because according to the 2023 figures, there are about 250,000 Indonesian people living in Taiwan, about the same number of Vietnamese people, 152 Filipinos, and about 68,000 Thai, and that together is about 700,000 people. Yeah. So their security is obviously one of concern. Yeah. And so ASEAN remains an important, and also ASEAN is Taiwan's second largest export market for Taiwan. Thank you. I think I'll stop there, but I'm happy to take questions. Perfect. And also comments.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Zsuzsa, especially also not for only presenting the implications that the elections in the Republic of China, Taiwan in January have on the cross-strait relations, but also the potentials that we have for Europe, and that it is indeed a two-way road. Before we go to questions and answers from the audience, I also have two very quick, very short questions to our speakers from my perspective. First, Gudrun Wacker, against the background that you have said at the very beginning that the EU is late in the game, is relatively disengaged in security issues in East Asia. Hearing, however, also Zsuzsa's perspectives that from China we cannot see any means of de-escalating the cross-strait relations. Do you think that there might be any game changes for the EU to become more active in the future in East Asian security? If so, what would those be?
I think the best we can do is to strengthen our own defense capabilities and share a bigger part of the burden of the United States in the European theater. I'm not seeing that European countries will send, fleets or air forces in a substantial way to East Asia. Might be a bit different in the Western Indian Ocean, where the EU also has a project. But our focus in the region, when we talk about security issues, has always been more than non-traditional security issues, capacity building in these areas, coast guards, illegal fishery, piracy, stuff like that. And the US has its alliance system in place. So I don't think that the US would be very happy. I mean, I attended some scenario workshops where the US position was actually, when there is a military conflict, we would want the French frigate to get out of the way, because frankly, we don't want to be concerned about them as well. And we have to think this through. How can we best de-escalate or contribute to stability in the region, not by drawing red lines? Mm-hmm. Because once the other side goes over the red line, you have to respond. If you don't respond, you lose credibility. But do we have an added value except on the soft security, non-traditional security, upholding international law? We are not there. So, if the US withdraws from the region, that's a different ballgame. But I think our role will remain limited. And allow me one sentence on Taiwan, because I think I agree with you that this is a positive development. But look at the official response from European governments to the election. The French government, I believe the EU as well, and the German government, they congratulated the Taiwanese people for holding a successful democratic election. They didn't even mention Lai Ching-te, as the winner of the election. They don't have to call him president, but he won the election, for crying out loud. Japan and the US named Lai Ching-te, and of course there was flack from China. And this is what we talked earlier today. We can be bolder as long as we know the price and are willing to pay it. Mm-hmm. And in this case, obviously, we will not. Mm-hmm. We just put out these Larifari congratulatory notes. Nice that you have a democracy there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Zsuzsa, I also have a question for you, probably also going back to what you've mentioned before when we talk about hybrid threats. When we talk about cybersecurity, you mentioned the cyber attacks with regards to the Taiwanese elections. Actually, the first time we met was in Taipei during a conference on information security. So can the EU, or should the EU, play probably a more active role, if not in the traditional security atmosphere and domains, not in the conventional security domains, but probably in collaborating with East Asian partners Taiwan, but also Japan, South Korea in the more unconventional security atmosphere?
Yes, that's an important element in the whole discussion. Taiwan's expertise in fighting disinformation and information manipulation and election interference. And that is something that both the EU and Taiwan already actually identified as an area of common interest. Again, when we say the EU, who do I mean, the EU and Taiwan? That's always, I think, the tricky part of the question, because if I elaborate who I mean, then I obviously here mean the European Parliament being the most vocal actor that is most willing to go to Taiwan in the context of parliamentary diplomacy. That is the most useful tool to embrace Taiwan. And for the first time, it was the committee, special committee of the parliament that deals with disinformation that sent a delegate or went in a delegation to Taiwan, and the leader of the delegation, a French MEP of the Green or Socialists or Greens, I forget, but Glucksmann said that we're here to learn. Mm-hmm. And that's also part of the conversation that we're having with Taiwan. So definitely this is already identified, and I think there's also strategic discussions happening on cyber, and in particular, I mean, there's a lot that is happening between the EU and Taiwan in terms of dialogues. There's a digital economy dialogue. I think the last one was in 2022, and that also touched upon cyber security and setting norms in terms of cyber security. So I think it's recognizing Taiwan's expertise and finding ways that are comfortable for both sides to circumvent the limitations that both sides face, because we shouldn't be any naive about how far the EU is going. And perhaps, Gudrun, the example you gave with the very vague messages of congratulations to the elections is a good example of how we keep going back and forth. But I think we're more forward than we were in the past in terms of having established a Taiwan discourse. And I hope I don't come across naive in this sense, but I do believe that there is value to that and there's substance. So the cyber issue is important also in the context of China and China-EU relations, and the whole hybrid concept, because Taiwan is a testing ground for a lot of the hybrid tactics that the PRC has been testing in Taiwan, and whatever can work there may work in other contexts. Of course, I also work quite a lot on these issues, and what we are looking at Taiwan is not what we can learn from Taiwan, but every context is different. So Taiwan can be an inspiration in terms of the response to threats, and it's also, again, part of this pushback that I think that the EU is also showing a sign of, that we are pushing back against aggressive behavior and sending a message that Taiwan is actually not alone. And I mean this in the very practical sense, not in a romantic sense, that I think there is substance to that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We have time for one more round of questions as well. I think Mr. Ström from VEW, you were the first one to raise your hand. Please, again, introduce yourself quickly and a very precise, short question, then we can allow it for more than one or two. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think this thing works perfect. So thank you very much. Very interesting presentations and discussions. I think the Taiwan issue fascinates me extremely. So, which is why I will ask Professor Ferenczy a question. If you look at the presidential elections, I mean, there was a three-party, basically, runoff for the elections. We had the Taiwanese People Party, right, the Democratic Progressive Party, and then the Kuomintang. And the Kuomintang are really interesting for me because of their views. I mean, what I understood, they want to have like a unification with China peacefully under a democratic government. Is this true? So this is something I read regarding the elections. So, yeah. I mean, how realistic is that? Yeah, and how realistic is a peaceful unification of Taiwan, basically, without a war? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Second question here in the second row.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a retired Austrian diplomat. My question would go: how do you assess the role of growing Chinese communities in Europe, in our countries, as facilitator maybe in the process? And a question to you for Taiwan. I mean, you mentioned cyber war, but isn't the fact that you may have, let's say, a fifth column, we called it, you know, we have in Europe experience in Austria with the Austrian Nazis, in Sudetenland, Heinlein with his fifth column helping Hitler to take it. Do you think there is a group in Taiwan that is more or less the ultimate solution to the Chinese and Xi Jinping's plans?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then we have one more question here at the fourth row, if I counted correctly, and one more from the ambassador. Yeah, please.
I'm Axel Hörhager, former official of the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg. Now, it's in fact Luxembourg that brings me to my question. I'll tell you how, via Taiwan. I mean, I think, you know, in February 22, Europe was very rattled by the aggression to Ukraine, and in particular the cyber attacks that preceded it. And one of the key cyber attacks by Russia was to knock out the Ukrainian military communication system on the satellites by identifying the channels. And Europe wouldn't have really noticed, except that they also knocked out half the wind farms in the North Sea. So people did notice and did identify. Taiwan, I think, had a similar experience when China severed 2 underwater cables, telecom cables, and said, hell, you know, we are going to be dependent for our security service, for fire, police, everything, on satellites. The problem with satellites is that, you know, the only really interesting new development that Taiwan is very interested in are constellations of satellite a la Elon Musk. But they also, Taiwan says, we don't want to be dependent on Elon Musk for our vital communications. Yeah. So what is the result? The result is, in fact, a rapprochement between Europe and Taiwan on this very issue. And in Luxembourg, there is the Société Européenne des Satellites that now wants to launch a constellation. Mm-hmm. The advantage being, if you knock out one of 5,000 satellites, the system still continues. So, I mean, on the ground, people in Taiwan and in Europe are very rattled by hardware cybersecurity. Yeah. This is not soft, this is hardware, vital hardware. And therefore, it does seem to be a real area of, you know, where you can create facts on the ground. And, you know, the modern global world is the global world. There's no, you know, okay, a frigate may get in the way, but cybersecurity is global, and Europe can't avoid that, and Taiwan can't avoid that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And last question from the ambassador in the first row. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My question is regarding the European security presence in the Horn of Africa and the eastern part of the Indian Sea, compared with their presence in the Indo-Pacific area. Is it going to do with the relation, I mean, the historic relations that Europe has with Africa, the commercial relations, and also the security interests of Europe compared with what is going in East Asia? The second is a comment regarding the response of Africa to the war in Ukraine. Yeah, in most of African countries, we see that the discourse is that this is not the first time that a permanent member of a Security Council invades another country. Mm-hmm. So we have seen it in 2003. We have when 2 members of the Security Council, permanent members, invaded a country in the Middle East. Then we have it in 2011, also 2 members of the Security Council also invaded an African country. And so for them, or for most of the people in Africa, they see that it is not a matter of international law per se, in the sense that international law is not always respected. So when it is, when international law is violated by some country, there is a lot of uproar. When it is invaded by another country, it is silence.
Yeah.
So this is a challenge for us. So this is why people in Africa have a different perspective on the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we have had a lot of various questions, different perspectives, all of them certainly equally interesting to touch upon at length. Maybe we need another evening for that. However, I'd like also to give our two speakers the chance to respond to some of the questions that were raised. Zsuzsa, I'd like to start with you this time.
Thank you. So a lot of questions and all good questions. I think the question that you raised, I think it also sheds light on a lot of misconceptions we have about Taiwan and Taiwanese identity and Taiwan as a society. And if I may say, and you kind of put your finger on it, but one of the misconceptions is that the KMT is pro-China and the DPP is pro-independence. There's a lot of different views inside Taiwan. It's not with or without China. You can be Taiwanese and feel Chinese at the same time, or you can be fully Taiwanese in itself. I mean, I take the liberty again to speak about this as a European, but it's again based on my perceptions. So I think there is, though, one overarching kind of agreement or consensus in society that democracy matters and free elections is what matters most, whether you are blue or green or white. So the debates, there have been a lot of very colorful debates and also difficult ones, but I think this overarching democracy element and also the existential threat that is kind of felt throughout Taiwan is something that I did observe. And on the question of whether there is some internal force or actor inside Taiwan among the Taiwanese who would want to push for unification with China, if that's the question, I think that was it. I mean, as it goes back to the previous response that I gave, that of course you find all kinds of views about China. You find people who are in favor of Taiwan to continue to be able to continue its existence, but also to do business with China. And then you find those who want to cut ties with China because China is aggressive and wants to unify and force by force. So you also find those who, but they're in a very small minority and a decreasing number who want unification with China. So I'm not denying that, but that's the nature of Taiwan's democracy, but they're a very small minority. On the cyber question, on the satellite question, yes, that's actually one of the lessons for Taiwan, watching what's happening in Ukraine and how Ukraine is defending itself and how vulnerable Ukraine was and how vulnerable Taiwan is because of the sea cables. And those are also the sea cables that link Taiwan to Japan and to the US, and they're all very vulnerable. So the investing in satellite is what is on the government's agenda, and I think this is thought through as a public-private enterprise so that it is not in the government's hand, but it's driven. And actually, that's also a good example of how a lot of what is happening in Taiwan is very much bottom-up. It's not a top-down approach, and that's another good way of describing how the PRC's top-down, opaque MO or modus operandi is very much in contrast with this bottom-up, not perfect, because Taiwan is not a perfect democracy, but it is really another good way of illustrating the contrast. So it's a good question, and I am in touch actually with the Luxembourg office in Taipei, so we can continue the conversation maybe.
Thank you very much, Zsuzsa. Gudrun, Wacker, you have the last word. Thank you for responding.
I also want to start with the satellites because the solution for Ukraine, Elon Musk is no solution for Taiwan because of Elon Musk's business relations with China. So it's as simple as that. And the question you raised about the Kuomintang is competing in a democratic system. If they want to be elected, they cannot step out and say, we are for unification, because we always talk about how divided the Taiwanese society is, but there is actually a more than 90% consensus that under the present circumstances, no unification, full stop. Yes, if China democratizes over the next decade, or Xi Jinping has a freak accident.
Democratic China, basically.
Well, there is no alternative to that. There might be some diehard, Lian Chen and the likes, who think unification as soon as possible, but that's probably 0.3% of the population, and the PFP, if it still exists, I don't believe it does. So it's just, if you want to be elected, you need to stay in a certain spectrum. And when Ma Ying-jeou even raised the issue of a peace negotiation with China when he competed for his second term, he was immediately shot down and he had to take it back. Mm-hmm. Even that, not even unification. Okay, final thing was the Chinese communities. This can fill an evening. I don't know if Chinese communities are growing in European member states. I think we have a real problem if we start to discriminate against every Chinese and put him under the suspicion that he's part of some united front effort of the Chinese. And the other, if you look at the literature that has been published on Chinese influence efforts, not only here but also in Australia, there are several books. The question is always, how do you measure the success of these operations? Do they really sway politicians? There are some obvious examples of politicians that have been bought. So I wouldn't be too concerned about Chinese communities as such, but we have to become more critical and look at, for example, our research cooperation and stuff like that. What is the background of academic institutions in China? I think this ASPI Trackle, this was an interactive database. It's now outdated, right? This is what we need. We need to map better what is going on with Chinese organizations. Where are they active? What is the background? Which research institutions are reliable in a world where Xi Jinping says the fusion of the military and the civil sector is fundamental for China.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, the audience, dear participants, for bearing with us, for your excellent questions, and for engaging into this discussion. I would like to thank also and seize the opportunity to IPLI, to Chairman Ambassador Cruz, to Timothy Reno for enabling also this collaborative event. Of course, also to our team at the AIS, who in the background have quite restlessly worked to enable this conference today. We will certainly continue to touch upon the various issues and topics that we discussed this evening, especially vis-a-vis also some of the aspects that you mentioned in the discussion. The relevance is certainly there, and just to give you a small spoiler and heads up, we're currently working on finalizing our chapter in the ET&C report and the European Think Tank Network on China's annual report, which will focus on de-risking. It will be released in the next couple of months, so this is certainly one thing in our whole realm of EU-China and East Asian topics that we are going to focus on and publish in the near future. Thanks again to our wonderful speakers for your great input and for certainly giving all of us a very comprehensive overview on the issues. You will have now the chance to interact on a more probably casual way with our speakers. We will invite you all on behalf of the organizers for a Rhine reception. There's also going to be a couple of snacks. So please feel warmly invited, enjoy the evening, and thank you again for coming and attending. Thank you very much.